Milk Creek 1879. Utes vs. U.S. Army Colorado 1879. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched lands of the White River Ute Reservation. A thin veil of dust hung in the air, stirred by the restless pacing of the Ute people. The promised annuities, the goods that were meant to sustain them through the harsh winter months, were long overdue. 160 miles to the east, in the bustling frontier town of Rawlins, Wyoming, a large government warehouse stood, filled to the brim with supplies. Inside, stacks of thick wool blankets, each one capable of warding off the biting mountain cold, reached towards the rafters. Crates overflowed with sturdy axes, their blades glinting in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the grimy windows. Cooking pots of varying sizes, from those meant for a single family to those large enough to feed a gathering, sat nestled amongst coils of rope and sacks of nails. Bolts of brightly colored cloth, enough to clothe the village, lay in piles beside sacks of flour, sugar, and coffee beans, their rich aroma a stark contrast to the dust and sweat that permeated the warehouse. There were boxes filled with shimmering beads and trinkets, promising hours of amusement for the Ute children, and even a few barrels of the Utes' coveted tobacco, its pungent scent mingling with the other goods. All of it sat idle, gathering dust while the Utes waited, their frustration growing with each passing day. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories. If you're intrigued by tales of resilience and resistance, subscribe for more captivating narratives from the past. The Utes, once renowned for their patience, grew gaunt and agitated. Whispers of discontent, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind, turned to murmurs of anger echoing through their camps. Nathan Meeker, the White River Indian agent, felt the shift in the atmosphere, the growing tension hanging heavy in the air. A man of high ideals, he envisioned transforming the Utes into farmers, integrating them into white society, a society he believed to be superior, yet he knew little of their ways. Their deep connection to the land, their warrior spirit that ran as deep as their roots in the earth. The Utes, proud and independent, bristled under Meeker's paternalistic rule. They had ceded vast tracts of land, their ancestral hunting grounds, in exchange for the government's promise to provide for their needs. Now they were being told to abandon their way of life, to become something they were not, to assimilate into a culture that sought to erase their identity. The Treaty of 1868, the document that had confined them to the reservation, had also promised them annual supplies, a lifeline in their forced transition to a sedentary life. But the treaty had been broken. The goods lay unused in the warehouse, while the Utes felt the pangs of hunger and the sting of betrayal. In the summer of 1879, Nathan Meeker strode across the dusty grounds of White River Agency, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. Where the Utes saw their cherished horse racing track, Meeker envisioned rows of corn and potatoes. Within days, his men had plowed under the packed earth, where generations of Ute warriors had raced their prized horses. The transformation of the racing track was just the beginning. Meeker ordered the construction of 12 wooden houses, their sharp angles and confined spaces, a stark contrast to the Utes' traditional teepees. A schoolhouse rose from the earth, its wooden walls echoing with the sound of 47 Ute children struggling to form English words, their native language strictly forbidden. The Bible replaced their tribal stories, arithmetic their traditional knowledge. The Utes watched as their world changed around them. Warriors who once rode freely across the plains now stood in clusters, their eyes following Meeker's every move. Their resistance manifested in small acts of defiance. 23 families refusing to move into the wooden houses, preferring their teepees. The school's attendance dwindled from 47 to 12 children within 2 months, as summer wore on. Promised supplies failed to arrive. At the agency's warehouse, the shelves that should have held blankets, provisions, and tools remained empty. Through the reservation's windows, Ute mothers watched their children wrap themselves in threadbare blankets from the previous year. Warriors who once hunted buffalo now had to stretch dwindling rations between 425 people. Meeker's vision, however noble in its intent, was fundamentally flawed. He knew little of the Utes, their traditions, their beliefs, their deep connection to the land, and their way of life. He saw their resistance to his plans as ignorance, as stubbornness as a refusal to embrace a better life. He failed to understand that for the Utes, their way of life was not simply a matter of survival, but of identity of who they were. The Utes' frustration erupted in waves. First came the hunting parties, 15 warriors leaving the reservation, despite Meeker's explicit orders. Then came the raids. 3 settler cabins burned in a single night, their occupants fleeing with only the clothes on their backs. Within a week, 7 more homesteads stood empty, their owners joining the growing stream of settlers, petitioning Governor Pickens for protection. Meeker's response only fueled the flames. His letters to Washington painted the Utes as savages, resisting civilization's embrace. Each morning, he gathered the tribe for mandatory prayer sessions, forcing 425 youths to kneel in the dirt while he read from his Bible. His reports condemned their heathen practices and lazy disposition, never acknowledging the skilled horsemanship and hunting traditions that had sustained the tribe for generations. The breaking point came with the arrival of General Pope's troops, a company of 35 buffalo soldiers. The moment the black soldiers appeared on the horizon, 127 Ute warriors spat on the ground and turned their backs within hours. Stories of past conflicts echoed through the camp, tales of buffalo soldiers killing Ute women during raids, of black troops desecrating sacred burial grounds. The warriors sharpened their arrows and loaded their rifles, muttering death before surrender to the Black Devils. The soldiers established camp on the reservation's edge, each tent positioned precisely 20 feet apart. That night, 3 arrows thudded into the center pole of the commanding officer's tent. By morning, every water barrel in the soldiers' camp had been poisoned with dead rattlesnakes. The Utes retreated to the hills, but their hatred remained palpable. 23 horses went missing from the soldiers' corral in the first week, their tracks deliberately leading into ambush points. The warriors' campfires dotted the hillsides each night, their numbers growing as more slipped away from Meeker's control, drawn by the prospect of confronting their most despised enemies. In the early days of autumn, tension crackled across the reservation like lightning before a storm. Meeker's morning prayers now echoed across nearly empty grounds. Only 67 Utes remained within the agency's boundaries. The rest had melted into the surrounding wilderness, their absence a silent protest against his authority. The buffalo soldiers patrolled empty pots between abandoned teepees, watched by unseen eyes from the hills. Governor Pickens' desk in Denver groaned under the weight of 156 settler petitions demanding protection. His telegrams to Washington painted an increasingly desperate picture. Situation at White River deteriorating, immediate action required. But Washington's response was silence, broken only by the occasional form letter acknowledging receipt of his concerns. As September drew to a close, the White River Agency had become a powder keg. Meeker stood at its center, still convinced of his righteous mission, blind to the gathering storm. The Utes moved like shadows through the hills, their patience exhausted, their anger building with each passing day. The buffalo soldiers maintained their patrols, unwitting catalysts in a conflict that had moved far beyond their control. The agency's walls now held 425 individual stories of frustration, cultural destruction, and brewing violence. Meeker's vision of a civilized Ute nation had instead created the perfect conditions for an explosion, one that would soon shake the very foundations of the American frontier. Meanwhile, the conflict between the Utes and the white settlers continued to escalate. A former Indian agent, Major James B. Thompson, had recently purchased a ranch on the Bear River near the reservation. Thompson, a man who believed in the superiority of the white race, had little respect for the Utes and their traditions. He had built his cabin on land that the Utes considered sacred, and he had openly flouted their customs and beliefs. One day while Thompson was away from his ranch, 2 Utes, Bennett and Chinaman, set fire to his cabin, reducing it to ashes. The act was a symbolic one, a message to Thompson and all white settlers that they were not welcome on Ute land. Thompson, enraged by the destruction of his property, sought justice through the white man's courts. He filed a complaint with Judge W.E. Beck of the 1st Judicial District in Colorado, and warrants were issued for the arrest of Bennett and Chinaman. However, the Grand County Sheriff, Marshal Bessie, and his posse were unable to apprehend the two youths, who had fled into the mountains. The posse visited Meeker at the reservation, hoping to enlist his help in capturing the fugitives. But Meeker, whose relationship with the Utes had deteriorated to the point of open hostility, could offer no assistance. The Utes, he knew, would never surrender two of their own to the white man's justice. The incident at Thompson's Ranch was just one of many that fueled the growing conflict between the Utes and the white settlers. The Utes, feeling increasingly threatened and marginalized, began to lash out, raiding settlements, stealing livestock, and setting fire to the forests that protected the white man's towns and farms. Word of the unrest at White River reached General Phil Sheridan, the famed Civil War hero and commander of the military division of the Missouri. Sheridan, recognizing the potential for a major conflict, decided to send reinforcements to the reservation. He dispatched Major Thomas T. Thornburg, commander of Fort Steele, Wyoming, with 3 companies of cavalry to White River. Thornburg's arrival at the reservation was met with a mixture of apprehension and defiance by the Utes. They knew that the presence of more troops would only increase the tension, but they were also determined to stand their ground and defend their rights. Captain Jack, the leader of the White River Utes, decided to take a bold step. He sent a message to Meeker requesting a meeting to discuss the Utes' grievances. He proposed that the meeting be held in the presence of Major Thornburg, hoping that the presence of a high-ranking military officer would ensure that the Utes' concerns were taken seriously. Meeker, wary of Captain Jack's intentions, agreed to the meeting. However, Major Thornburg, suspicious of the youth's motives, refused to attend. He believed that the meeting was a ruse, a trap designed to lure him away from his troops and into a vulnerable position. Captain Jack, angered by Thornburg's refusal, decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew that Thornburg's troops would have to pass through a narrow defile on their way to the reservation, a perfect spot for an ambush. He gathered his warriors and laid his plans, determined to teach the white soldiers a lesson they would not forget. When Thornburg's column reached Milk Creek, a tributary of the Bear River, they were met by a hail of gunfire from the Utes, hidden in the surrounding hills. The soldiers, caught in a deadly trap, fought back bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Major Thornburg, realizing the futility of their situation, ordered his men to form a defensive line and hold their fire until the Utes attacked. The Battle of Milk Creek had begun, a bloody and brutal clash that would mark a turning point in the conflict between the Utes and the white settlers. The Utes, intimately familiar with the folds and crevices of their ancestral lands, moved with an agility and stealth that belied their numbers. They were phantoms in the dappled sunlight, their moccasined feet barely disturbing the dry leaves and pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. With the cunning honed from generations of warfare, in these very mountains they flanked Thornburg's column, their warriors melting into the shadows of the high bluffs that overlooked the narrow defile. Thornburg, a seasoned soldier, felt a prickle of unease as he surveyed the terrain. The defile, a natural choke point, was a perfect killing ground. He dispatched his adjutant, Lieutenant Samuel Cherry, a young officer with more courage than experience, to parley with the Utes. Cherry, his face pale but resolute, rode towards the Ute lines under a flag of truce, the white cloth a stark contrast against the somber hues of the mountains. "I seek a council with your leader," Cherry called out, his voice amplified by the canyon walls. His words hung in the air unanswered. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the pines and the distant calling of a crow. Suddenly a shot shattered the tense silence. It was a single shot, its origin unknown, its purpose unclear. Was it an accident, a nervous trigger finger, or a deliberate act of aggression? The answer was lost in the maelstrom that followed. The Utes, interpreting the shot as a signal to attack, unleashed a storm of lead and fury upon the soldiers. From the bluffs, from behind trees and boulders, the warriors fired their rifles, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the canyon. The soldiers caught in the open scrambled for cover, returning fire in a desperate attempt to defend themselves. The Battle of Milk Creek had begun, a bloody and brutal clash that would leave a lasting scar on the history of the West. Major Thornburg, riding back to check on the supply train, was struck by a Ute bullet. The projectile pierced his ear, killing him instantly. His body slumped in the saddle, his lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. The command of the beleaguered troops fell to Captain Payne of the 5th Cavalry, a seasoned officer who had seen his share of combat. Payne, though wounded in the arm, quickly took charge. He ordered his men to dig trenches and use the wagons and their contents as breastworks. The soldiers, their faces grim, set to work, their shovels biting into the hard-packed earth. The Utes, seeing the soldiers digging in, responded with a tactic as old as warfare itself. They set fire to the dry grass and sagebrush that covered the hillsides, the flames quickly spreading through the tinder-dry vegetation. Dense clouds of smoke rolled down the slopes, engulfing the soldiers in a choking haze. The soldiers, with no water to fight the flames, were forced to use their blankets and coats to smother the fire. Their efforts hampered by the thick smoke and the constant rain of Ute bullets. The Utes, positioned on the high ground, had a clear view of the battlefield, and they picked off the soldiers one by one, their rifles cracking with deadly accuracy. The soldiers were trapped, unable to advance or retreat. To make matters worse, Captain Jack, sensing victory, ordered a charge. His warriors surged down the slopes, their war cries echoing through the canyon. The soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought back with desperate courage, their rifles blazing in a futile attempt to hold back the tide. Payne, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, called for a volunteer to seek help. A scout named Joe Rankin stepped forward, his eyes filled with a grim determination. Rankin, a skilled horseman and tracker, knew the risks involved.